Hi, good afternoon. I'm Lacy. I'm an international addictions and trauma specialist. Been in the field around 36 years, working in this field, and have been honored to participate in some, like in Vietnam, Mexico, um, and building treatment centers here in the States. And so I've spent many years initially as a clinician working in the clinical side of the house, and then moved to the business side. And in the last couple of years, I've just been able to support people, support investors who've been really dedicated at building something to really help and cause change. And I've invested myself personally in whatever their projects seem to be that I really can believe in. So it's a pleasure.
I mean, that's great. Thank you for being here. I would imagine being in the field of addictions and trauma for 36 years, it wasn't always trauma in the beginning. I'd love to hear a little bit about where it was then and where you've seen it kind of come around how we relate trauma to addiction or trauma in general.
Sure. Let me just throw in that I started this thing off as a Marine and serving in Vietnam. So trauma is dear to my heart. And it came out of Vietnam, and I didn't really see it. Nobody ever talked about it. And I was a welcome guest to the bottle of alcohol, and that's how I took care of it. Unbeknownst to me, but that's how I took care of it. And I struggled in a couple of their treatment facilities. I just didn't get it, truthfully. And I finally got sober almost 40 years ago and did relatively well professionally, did relatively well in life. At about the 25-year mark of sobriety, this PTSD, the trauma began creeping out, and I didn't see it. And I had to ask for help. So when I started working in the field, we never talked about it, ever. It never came out. You may have talked about people who could have been identified maybe as having been sexually abused, and it usually stayed in that realm. We work strictly in using I did a lot of work under Irvin Yalom, and the aims and purposes of group psychotherapy, and these were great strategies. But I've come to learn it's more of a surface strategy. Yeah. And although we were I was training therapists for years and talking about getting down to those, even as the book we're talking, the causes and conditions, never really got down there. And I'll say this, the majority of our patients and clients were walking out, and from what I know today, not from what I knew then, but from what I know today, our patients were walking out and they hadn't gotten 100% of the deal. And so I've dedicated myself in the last few years to making sure, whenever I've had the opportunity to open up a treatment facility or working with clients, is that we really get to take a look at that and stop, and just stop, and really work there. And I've seen people begin to recreate themselves. I think we used to be taught about like getting rid of the trauma, getting it out of our system. I'm personally not a believer in that way of doing it. I think that the trauma is, in some sense, cellular in that dynamic. Yeah. However, the shift of my relationship with the trauma is what brought me freedom. Yeah. So that's where that's how I've been empowered now by, as I called it, Buddha. Eddie and the Buddha. And Eddie and the Buddha came through because of the Four Noble Truths. And even the Buddha talked about you have to get raw to begin to do that work and accept a habit, and B, that I'm responsible for it getting worse if I don't do something about it now. And that's the rawness, that acceptance. And then we walk on about there's a path, and we can really begin to do the work in life and see life differently And so when I was asked about the theme of why I was going to give this talk, I have a 900-pound Buddha in my home. And I swear, some people, I think I bought a home and it had a Buddha. I think I bought a Buddha and he had a home, because he's right in this foyer as you walk in, and I knew that's where I was going to live. And that really began to change my process. So it's Eddie and the Buddha.
That's really great. You know, when I was a young clinician, I was fortunate, and I'll say fortunate, what I'm going to say after that doesn't sound fortunate for the people, but I was fortunate enough, I think, to hear at least 3 to 5 men in a year period who were successful, had families, had money, were sober 20 to 25 years. And I'm on the phone with them in a conversation, and they're saying, Ryan, I'm either going to drink or I'm going to kill myself. And I don't know what to do. And I say I'm fortunate because it allowed me to really see, you know, what can happen if you don't address these guys were able to handle the symptoms for a long time, and all of them had never really addressed what was underneath. And when they did, it wasn't much. It didn't take as much as they thought, but they were able to achieve a new freedom. You know, that real new freedom and a new happiness, you know. And I think that's, if I can ever impart one message to my clients, it's, you know, we can't change the trauma. It's happened. It's there. The events are done. We can, like you said, change our relationship with it and move our history from being a liability that drives us to an asset that informs us, and it becomes something that's valuable to us.
Yes, you're very true.
And you can't do that on day one. You know, you don't just try to get people to think positive. They've got to go down into the muck and mire of it and able to move through it, you know, and those noble truths that all life is suffering, and we suffer because of our desires. And often that desire is, I don't want to feel the way that I'm feeling, or I want to feel the way that I used to feel. And it just pulls us out of that presence.
Correct. Absolutely correct.
You know, and that trauma is, I think, the problem. And maybe you can tell me if it's, the problem is us going into survival mode when we don't need to be in survival mode. An appropriate response at an inappropriate time.
Right.
And when we can really be with our folks and be present with them, we can help them see that, you know, you can create enough space to just not make that choice that's going to hurt you or somebody else.
Very well put.
If you could see the field of trauma work go anywhere, where would you like to see it go?
Let me preface by one thing. I need to put this part in there too, because we've been talking here and using masculine terminologies, and I use PTSD and combat and everything. And part of my task has been working with clients also that I had a group of women come up to me after a talk once, 2 or 3, 4 years ago, and every one of them said about the same. They were in a single line coming up to thank me, and in this line there's 3 or 4, and they each said about this. Well, you know, I was never in combat. I was just sexually abused. I said, well, stand aside, please, right here. And it happened 3 or 4 times. And I had the honor after we went and found a quiet corner, and sat and talked about there's no difference between my trauma and their trauma. It's the trauma. And we sit there and degrade ourselves based on my story or your story. And I think sometimes, as you were just asking about, where we have to get therapists, get the educators in on this, to begin to really talk, as you did, about the part that it is at cellular level. But to get the new clinicians to begin to understand, what does that really mean? And I think that, one, that's where the educators can come in. And 2, I would like to see in some way, to do, instead of doing like the addiction, trauma, and what is to do something like this. Now, I got to watch this page. I want to keep them alive while I'm doing it. But you see what I'm saying? Is that if we can do that kind of work, I think the level of freedom that our clients will have as they walk out that door and go into another phase, because it's in phases, because you mentioned I can't do this overnight. I've got to building that trust with that right person to be able then to do the work is so important. It is the field, I believe, you're beginning to hear the word trauma a lot. And I think that that's bad. Because I don't truthfully believe there's that many people out there who knowingly know exactly what they're doing in dealing with trauma. But it's become a theme. Whether it's an insurance theme or some other way of acknowledging it, I'm not quite sure. But I just want to shy back from that. Because I understand the depth of it, both now professionally and personally, to know the quality of work that we now are getting tasked to do so we can help men and women who suffer from it. I like what you also said earlier. I have a friend of mine, a Navy captain. 6'5", easy, coal black hair, not one hair out of place. He was a hot, Top Gun all the way, flew the OV-10 for a long time in Vietnam, hated to fly, hated flying, hated it. And his anger around his father and everything was coming out when he was pulling the trigger on that OV-10. And he carried that and carried that and carried that with him. And he finally, after his retirement, went and got help. Medals to hear. Were the medals because of the exerted effort he had to do to control the trauma? Or was he just a great combatant? And since I know him personally, no. That's how he took care of the trauma. And he is he would be a Top Gun. You walk in here right now, you'd see him, you go, oh my God, this is him, the real one, Yeah.
A couple things you said, and then that example, and I got to be careful sometimes how I say this because I don't want to diminish anybody's experience or painful experiences in life. But if it's about the relationship with the trauma, then it's not really about the trauma. Now, we need to work with the events to help lessen some symptoms that you may have because of things you experienced in combat or all of that, right? But everybody that I've worked with that, they say that's kind of the annoying stuff. That's the stuff there's other stuff underneath it, right? That the relationship part started before the trauma happened. How was I shaped that in such a way that I'm reacting to this event in the way that I am for the period of time that I am, right? Of course, anybody in combat should have some sort of experience. Anybody that's abused should have some sort of negative experience. But when it's lasting longer and it's being triggered in a way that it's like it's happening now, that's where it's problematic. And different people react to things differently, the same thing differently.
Yeah, it has to be looked at.
Right, it has to be looked at. And the relationship in how we relate to life started before that. And what are the other things that have filled that bucket? I mean, that story of your friend is a perfect example. And another example of how that shaping also made him good and survive something. But then it sounds like he was still fighting it after the battle was over. Right. And he wasn't even fighting the battle that he was fighting when he was fighting it.
And he didn't know he was fighting that.
Right.
Yeah.
So that awareness and trying to, at least show people that, that I agree with you. The word trauma is sometimes that means we mention it. Sometimes it means there's one group. Sometimes it means we send you to talk to somebody else. And that's doing a disservice. I really like to look at and try to broaden that definition and even work with people. And it's just how you were shaped. In your formative years. We call them formative years for a reason, right? We're formed then in the brain. And so, I think what you've said is really powerful.
I think what you say is true. It's like, and I heard this, but I like how it was put out there. It's the wagon wheel that gets stuck in the mud, and it keeps going around, and it makes a groove deeper, and it's deeper, and it's deeper. And I look at that systemically. It's in us deeper, and it's in, as you talk, it's in the changing of the brain, the functioning of the brain, because the grooves are set. Now, the work is to go identify that. It's not against me, it's just a part of who I am.
Right.
and then give with work. We know we can change the brain. We know that. And we get to be able to take a look at those grooves and how they've affected us in relationships, how they've affected us in the mirror, how they've affected us flying an OV-10, how they affected in a combat situation. I mean, I have never seen a picture of me in Vietnam without a smile. How in the hell can that be? And I have them around my office just to go, you gotta be kidding me. Bombs are going off and we would run into the bunkers and fly into the bunkers in the mud and then laugh our rear ends off in there. I was 19 years old. But I had been groomed in a family system that was extremely rigid, that I was at peace. And I carried that back out of Vietnam, and it didn't work out here. You know.
I have one last question. If you had an audience of every person in the world that's struggling with some trauma, whether they know it or not, but they know that they're in pain, and you could say one thing to them, what would it be?
Well, you got my stuff going now. I just have to share my relationship with it and how I could walk through it. And using my sense of self to try to convey to them to trust me and just walk this walk, as what you and I have just talked about, to take a look at the impact that whatever you want to call it, trauma in our lives have had on us. Get them to trust me that the walk is extensive, but they'll be surrounded in, safety is so important, surrounded by trained clinicians, people who really genuinely care about them, using different modalities to help them discover more about the impact of that trauma in their life and learning how to live with it honorably. And for the women I use the word with dignity. Yeah. That's what I would try to do. Eddie and the Buddha.
Well, thank you for doing this. And I actually lied. I have one more question. I haven't asked anybody this yet that we've been doing this. And just two men sitting here. Can I give you a hug?
Oh, you sure may. My God. Oh.